Great. So I'd like to welcome our viewers to Phenomenology of the Phenomenon. This is a series where we discuss the application of the philosophical tradition of phenomenology to the study of unidentified aerial phenomena and close encounters. This series is produced by the Society for UAP Studies, and I am the host, Kimberly Engels. And my guest today is Karin Austin, who is the executive director of the John E. Mack Institute, also known as GEMI. So first of all, just Karin, thank you very much for being here today.
Of course. Thank you for inviting me. Happy to have the conversation with you.
I'm very much looking forward to everything we're going to discuss today. Just to start, a short biography of Karin. So as I said, she is the executive director of the John E. Mack Institute, also known as GEMI. This is a nonprofit organization. She transitioned into this role during the pandemic as a recovering small business owner who provided home renovation services in the Chicago real estate marketplace. There, while meeting the daily demands of her projects in a dynamic and notoriously challenging industry, she cultivated a broad skill set in design, systems thinking, team leadership, sales and marketing, conflict resolution, and budget management. These days, she's applying those skills to the best of her ability in collaboration with GEMI's executive team and the development directors as they endeavor to build out the infrastructure needed to actualize the Institute's ambitious goals. As an abduction experiencer herself, who worked with Dr. Mack, and like so many others, was profoundly impacted by his warmth, compassion, character, and courage, her personal evolution and thinking on the phenomenon remain ongoing. With deepest respect for the man and his organization's legacy, Karin hopes GEMI's revived mission will play a meaningful role in facilitating humankind's proactive transition into a peaceful, equitable, and unified global community. So, beautiful bio. And before I dive in to, talking about what phenomenology is and getting into the meat and potatoes of our discussion, I just wanted to give you a little opportunity to just tell our viewers a little bit about, GEMI, about the Institute. What are the values? What are the goals? A little spiel you might have about GEMI as an organization. Anything you want to share? I know it's a big question.
Yeah, that's jumping right into the deep end for sure. Well, maybe the easiest place to start is how I ended up here, which was, as you pointed out, when the pandemic hit the U.S. and we went into lockdown. I think for a lot of people it was a moment of self-contemplation, and I certainly fell into that category and realized that there was an opportunity there either to continue on the path that I was on, which was sort of successful in a mainstream kind of way, but not very personally fulfilling. And in fact, I was working 80-hour weeks, and I was spending all of my best life force on just making nice things for for people, nice kitchens and bathrooms. And while that's helpful, that wasn't making my soul feel very happy about what I was doing. So there was this opportunity to attune to, well, what is next in my life. And what showed up very quickly in that vacuum of a question was this inspiration that came up to reanimate GEMI and to pick up where the organization and John had left off at the event of his untimely death. And I had a vision that felt very much like a download. I was very clear about the work that was incomplete, or at least mostly clear about it. I understood that there was research that needed to be evolved and developed, and that there was an entire experiencer community who had been sort of left behind in the ways that the cultural dialogue had evolved around, UAP and sort of a new generation of experiences that were much less confrontational in certain ways than I think what a lot of abduction experiencers went through at the end of the 20th century. So maybe between the 70s and the 90s. And I have spent the better part of the last almost 3 years, pulling together, coalescing a broad community of academics and veteran, experiencers and people who were connected to John in the past, as well as folks who are interested in the phenomenon now, to work to bring them all together to create a shared vision for what we understand Jemmy's role is moving forward. And at the moment, the main responsibility seems to be a focus on, again, completing not only the research that John and Jemmy, which was at the time the Center for Psychology and Social Change and the Program for Extraordinary Experiences Research. There was research that was done that has never really seen the light of day. So we're working on making that happen. But then more importantly, there's an inspiration and an understanding about the critical importance of pulling together a broad metadata research project that to the best of our ability includes all of the highly credible and renowned researchers who have materials on the phenomenon like John did, and are interested in pulling all of that together and applying those materials to AI and coming out with a look at the data sans any interpretation by researchers, whether that's Bud Hopkins or David Jacobs or John Mack himself. So our values and what we're prioritizing right now is really about what can we do to get the experiencer narrative again lifted from all of these materials, and then do a statistical analysis of it so that we can, to your point, really start to understand the full phenomenology, at least from the experiencer perspective, of what is actually happening here. And we look at the phenomenon in general as a kind of a two-sided coin. On the one side, there's the UAP phenomenon, the nuts and bolts, which are visible and accessible to us right now. And on the other hand, is this other side of the coin. There is the experiencer narratives, the phenomenology of the phenomenon as it made contact with us. And this disparity right now, with this emphasis all on the UAP nuts and bolts side, with literally almost no emphasis on the experiencer phenomenology side, is very problematic. And it's helping a lopsided narrative unfold that does not represent what the phenomenon is entirely. So our value system, in short, I know I'm sort of mixing it all together, but we're experiencer advocates, and we are doing everything we can at this point to elevate and amplify, their narratives and the meaning and importance of these narratives in the cultural dialogue.
Excellent. Thank you so much. For our viewers who may not know, John Mack was a Harvard psychiatrist who was primarily the first serious academic to take experiencer testimonies, experiencers who reported having been abducted by some type of non-human intelligence. So they were known as, alien abductees. He was the first mainstream academic to take their testimony seriously. Karin's talking about the importance of experiencer narratives, and Dr. Mack, or John's work, was all focused on that question of taking experiencer narratives seriously and really taking all of experiencer testimony seriously, whatever they had to report to him. So we're going to dive into that a bit more in a second when we are really unpacking kind of the phenomenology. But the John E. Mack Institute, or JEMI, is now, taking up his legacy with that very important emphasis, this idea of, there's a gap right now in the cultural conversation about UAP. There's the scientists are on board. They're having, these nuts and bolts discussions about the radar, about, what's appeared to military personnel in the sky, what the instruments are saying. But on the other hand, as you've pointed out, there's this data, there's the testimony, the testimony from people who have had contact experiences, including abduction experiences with these non-human intelligences, that right now doesn't have, a home in the cultural conversation.
Correct.
All right, excellent. So what I want to do now is I want to share, if I can do this correctly. I'm always a little, let's see, window. Yes. I want to just, for our viewers, talk a little bit about what phenomenology is. And I just have a few slides with a few descriptions of phenomenology. So phenomenology is a philosophical method that is rooted in the rigorous examination of first-person consciousness or first-person experience. The founder of phenomenology was Edmund Husserl, and he advocated a method of bracketing in which we suspend judgment on the source or origin of what is being interacted with and describe what appears. Now, something that is very important in phenomenology is that it involves describing exactly what appears or appeared to the individual, as well as how what appears was received, organized, and classified by the person who experienced it, by the conscious subject. So the one having the experience, what judgments did they form about that experience and how did they form them? And with phenomenology, we have to be very careful about describing exactly how an object is given or presented to consciousness. So is it a perceptual object? Is it being given directly in sense experience? Is it a remembered object that we saw previously that we're bringing back to our consciousness? Is it an imagined object, something that we are bringing up in our imagination? Or sometimes with UAP and close encounter, there might be new ways that objects are being given to consciousness that, we might call non-ordinary perception. And with phenomenology, first of all, you have to be careful to, describe exactly what is being given in what way, but also very importantly, you take into consideration everything that is being presented. So while the scientific method is focused on collecting physical evidence that can be objectively verified in controlled conditions, so that's the nuts and bolts side of UAP encounters, the phenomenological method rigorously examines the experience of the witness, what they saw, what they heard, what they sensed, what they felt, and what they formed judgments about. So with that in mind, let me click out of this somehow. Let me get back over to you. Okay, there we are. With that in mind, so, GEMI is an organization. It's got to focus on, eyewitness testimony, experience your narratives. And we see also here that there is a method that is also focused on, on eyewitness testimony. That's kind of the basis. But, phenomenology is different than just a strictly narrative approach, because phenomenology looks at, what appears to consciousness, how did it appear? And it's very descriptive in terms of trying to, sort out exactly what was presented in what ways. And so part of the reason that I think it's so, useful and fruitful for talking about close encounters, potential abduction experiences, just testimony of experiencers is that, these narratives or this testimony, some of what is experienced really challenges our fundamental assumptions about reality. And so if you're taking a strictly like nuts and bolts scientific approach, first of all, it's not going to conform to being repeatable and observable under those controlled conditions. But second, you're going to just be essentially shutting out a huge part of the testimony that you're arguing is, impossible from a scientific standpoint, if not potentially all of the testimony. Or with phenomenology, we say, no, let's first of all, we'll take a step back and let's look at what did they experience consciously. So just having explained that for, the viewers and just for our conversation, do you see that method in line with, the approach that you want to take at GEMI in the kind of, academic work that you want to produce, or that you're hoping, you're hoping to restore experience or testimony into the cultural dialogue? Do you think phenomenology has a role to play with that?
I think it definitely does. It absolutely does. It has to. It has to. There's we can try to avoid it sort of as collectively as a culture, I suppose, for as long as we want, but we do so, I mean, without trying to be too dramatic, we do so at our own peril, or to our own disadvantage, maybe is a better way to say it. Because even though experiencer witness statements, experiencer testimony, it's just chock-a-block full of high strangeness that creates a lot of cognitive dissonance for people who are hearing it for the first time. As much as it does, by the way, for experiencers who were going through it for the first time, right? It's not that we were all wishing for this or imagining that this might happen someday. For most experiencers who went through the abduction events in particular, none of us saw this, none of us saw it coming. And we were as completely shocked and traumatized by it as the mainstream culture sort of maybe unconsciously is every time they hear an experiencer, speak as truthfully as possible to, the weirdness that happened. The knee-jerk reaction comes from a deeply internalized scientific materialist worldview that says reality operates in a certain way, and anything that doesn't operate like that isn't real. And to the point that you made earlier, if it's not replicatable in an empirical way, in the lab or in some other way, then again, it doesn't satisfy the definitions or fall within the boundaries of our physicalist paradigm. So it's problematic. But just because it's problematic doesn't mean that experiencers aren't telling the truth. We are telling the truth. We don't understand hardly any at all of what happened to us. But we know that it happens. And I think part of what matters in determining how much weight we can give to the phenomenology, piece of this, maybe starts with who and what, or how do we deem or determine who is a credible witness, right? So, and that was a large part of what John's organization here, worked to do, very carefully at the time. So he was, they had a very specific intake process. People who report, got in touch with Pierre, for seeking help from John, had to go through a series of interviews to begin with, usually before they even made it into an initial appointment with him. There was an initial evaluation, at least in the dialogue between John and the experiencer, to determine, to the best of his ability, was there any presence of psychopathology, or was the individual presenting as a normal, healthy individual? And, suffice it to say, the largest majority of the time, I can't say an exact percentage, we'll know more about it after we've done our research, but 90% or more of the time, he was dealing with, not only a reasonably sane, but a otherwise healthy individual who was simply having a really hard time metabolizing these impossible encounters that actually happened, right? So, John would talk about how he determined a credible witness. You kind of briefly mentioned this, by how they presented, themselves in the conversation and sessions with him. Did they have an appropriate emotional affect, that went along with the impossibility, the unbelievableness of what happened to them? Was there any self-awareness, self-reflection? I know this sounds impossible, but this happened. Or they would, we would sometimes say, I wish I was crazy. I wish there was a pill that you could give me that would make this go away. It would be simpler, to have some kind of mental health disorder, account for it. But, as the interviews would go on, it would become very clear that the pathology wasn't present. There weren't any satisfying or other viable, alternative explanations for the narrative that was being, conveyed by the experiencer. And so at that point, John, being, in the intellectually muscular and courageous and honest, psychiatrist and professor that he just got present and listened and started taking in data. And he did that. By the time that he was sort of on the other side of researching this, he talked to thousands of experiencers around the world, but we have 200 case studies, somewhere around 200 case studies, where he was very rigorous about his process. So that's sort of thing one. I'll pause there. I have more to add to, the idea of what makes a credible witness. I know a lot of people think John just hypnotized, people, and that they pulled things out of hypnosis, and that's really not true. And I want to speak to that, but I want to pause to see if there's anything you want to say to what I was just saying.
No, I think what you're saying actually is extremely important, and I do want to get deeper into John's method, the way that he really took in what was communicated sincerely and authentically to him. But I think this question of witness credibility is really important, because this, I wasn't expecting to go here, but I think this is a good place to go, because this gets brought up every time that we start talking about eyewitness testimony and using phenomenology. There's often this idea of what reason do you have to think that people are telling the truth, or what reason do we have to think that anything that these people were reporting to them was actually presenting to them in the way that they said. And then also there's those critiques of the use of hypnosis too. Some people accuse Dr. Mack of using leading questions, that he was producing these accounts, and I think that's also inaccurate. So I think this is a perfectly fine place to go, and I'd like to hear more of what you'd have to say about witness credibility.
Okay. Well, the first place I'm inclined to go is to just point out that for many, maybe even most abduction experiencers, we had a large preponderance, or certainly a significant collection of memories that resulted from conscious interactions that were explicit. So the memories were explicit and did not require hypnosis to recall. Right. So it's and it's speaking from for myself, someone who had these experiences, had I not had conscious encounters with the physical aspects of this phenomenon, including physical biological beings, then while I was in waking state consciousness again, then I would not have been somebody who was running to look for assistance in figuring out what the hell was going on. I would have just assumed I was in some imaginal, dream state or other weird consciousness state that was unfamiliar to me at the time. And I would have just found a different way to deal with it. I certainly wouldn't have been, compelled to go get assistance. I just would have dealt with it in my own way, in my own personal life. The problem of these events is that they're so confrontational when they occur. And again, I'll speak for myself. I actually didn't start with John, or mental health professional. I started with NASA, and I started, and And NASA referred me to another agency, and that agency couldn't help. And then they referred me to MUFON. And then, MUFON wasn't the right, assistance for me at the time. And then I, ended up through a circuitous way, finding my way to John. So in terms of the credibility, if we just start from the place of many of the abduction experiencers had encounters, again, in a waking state consciousness that is every much as real and online as you and I are together right now. So that's thing one. You either believe someone who's saying this to you, or you don't. If we just stick with the reports of the conscious encounters. If we talk about what the motivations would be for someone to do this, to speak out loud, oh, I've had abduction experiences, or I had these, conscious interactions with these very exotic looking non-human intelligences, there's no payoff for it that makes it worthwhile. And experiencers have repeated this over and over again for the past 2 to 3 decades when asked this question. There's nothing fun that comes out of this in the public. Nothing, right? This is about public ridicule. It's about family ridicule. It's about not being believed. Nobody gets rich off of doing this. There's no financial reward in doing it. It's embarrassing to talk about. Anybody who's of sound mind, and most of us are in this process, this is not a club that anybody wanted to belong to, and it's not a club that we would have wanted to go public with. But it has the phenomenon has and especially the experiencer side of it as well, has such profound implications for humankind that it is more inauthentic, it is more inappropriate, it is more irresponsible to not speak about these things in public. Consequences be damned, because what's happening here holds these massive implications for humankind's understanding of our place in the universe, right? So we have to speak to it. We have to speak of it. And so part of what makes somebody credible or not, right? That most of us have a sense for when someone's telling the truth and when they're not. So some of it is we just have to do a personal check-in. The other part of it is that, lots of us would have been willing to take, what do you call it? Lie detector tests. We would have subjected ourselves to any manner of testing. For what it's worth, there was a double-blind psychometric personality test that John had done. This is one of the ones that hasn't been released yet, on 40 experiencers and 40 non-experiencers, looking for the prevalence of psychopathology. Not only wasn't any higher psychopathology in experiencers, they were inclined on the whole to be in a healthier state than the category of non-experiencers. Additionally, in a separate Rich McNally, Susan Clancy study, which is sort of by now infamous, I was a participant in this, they went through the entire process of using experiencers as a controlled group against PTSD soldiers, right, to demonstrate that when hooked up to all these measurements of what is it, like heart rate and skin moisture and that sort of thing, that these are physiological responses to PTSD that all the way up until the moment of that study, every academic and doctor understood that the human body cannot produce a physiological response based on a lie. So what Susan Clancy and Rich McNally didn't say to us in the beginning when they were looking for experiencers to take part in the study was that they were assuming that the experiencer control group was not going to have any physiological responses because everybody knows that aliens aren't real and these people are obviously lying. What the results found was that the experiencers were actually at times even more physiologically reactive from a PTSD trauma perspective than even the soldiers were. And when Rich McNally went to report the findings in front of a committee of his peers. I was there watching next to John. His peers said to him, Rich, you are arguing against the outcome of the results of your own data. Your data shows that they have had actual encounters. Well, nobody knows that story because that story hasn't made it to the public, right? What they know is Susan Clancy's story about it's got to be sleep paralysis or it's a dream. It's, the experiencer community has heard all of those things. Like, we can't tell the difference between sleep paralysis and being awake. We can't tell the difference between hallucination and being awake. The whole presumption of how this phenomenon must not be happening the way experiencers are describing is predicated on this idea that we are incapable of correctly evaluating on a moment-to-moment basis our own orientation with reality. It's deeply offensive at its worst and exasperating at its most neutral. I'll pause. You got me wound up.
No, I love your passion because it's really important, actually, what you're talking about. And, the physiological responses that you are mentioning, even before I was like deeply interested in the phenomenon in the way that I am now, I was always really interested in the Hopkinsville encounter. And I read a book on the Hopkinsville encounter when I was younger. And I remember that they said, in that encounter, the family in Kentucky, they saw these beings were at their house. They were like firing bullets at them. And then they drove into town at like 3:00 in the morning to the police station. And reading the police testimony about, how these people appeared when they got there, they were terrified. Some of them had like a pulse of like 160 beats a minute or something like that. And, the officer on the scene was just saying, you can't make that up. Like, you can't fake that. You can't fake a pulse rate of that amount, Yeah. And he was saying, and also, he said, these aren't the kind of people who like spook or scare easily, who are going to just go to the police for no reason. He said something very profound, something otherworldly, or something just not something outside of our normal understanding of what reality is happened to those people that night.
Yeah, can I add on to that real quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I would just say that, again, including myself and lots of other people I know, we're not hysterical types. I was a very grounded, straightforward, mainstream, conservative, was listening to Rush Limbaugh at the time, was raised in a Southern Baptist environment. There was nothing woo about me. And I had never heard of, this was like the early to mid 90s. I had never heard of alien abduction. Nobody had ever talked about that. It just wasn't on the radar. If it was barely. And, there was no social media around this. There weren't books out about it at the time, or at least, again, not that I knew of. So it was, there was no sort of, being influenced by the kind of onslaught of data that we have right now. I mean, it would be different in context right now, but it was a very pure, terrifying encounter at the time that was extremely confrontational, to most of us who went through it. It's not a fun encounter to begin with. At least the physical interactions are really, terrifying. They very quickly put us into the most animal part of who we are as human beings. And there's the fight or flight mechanism in the brain is really online. And to your point, creating racing pulses and that sort of thing. And again, during waking state consciousness. I would add one more thing about John's use of hypnosis. So first of all, he didn't use it nearly as much as people think that he did. And he might have done it earlier on as he was finding his way in the process. But what he found out pretty quickly was that hypnosis wasn't actually required. All we had to do was sit down, in session with him, take a couple of deep breaths, really, like nothing more than you would do with, a yoga meditation exercise. And then everything that hadn't been available, consciously there before, it's almost like the psyche represses it because it's too weird, it's too traumatizing, too painful. in the moment, to deal with. And so it smushes it, and I'm using highly technical terms here. But, once we were in a context, again, with John, where as a, exemplary professional at what he did, he was exceptional at creating this safe space, that allowed us to sort of set aside for at least the time of the session, our own inner state of disbelief about it, and then be able to speak truthfully in the moment about the high strangeness of all of it, without all of this self-judgment and self-incrimination, because look, we all know this is impossible. It can't be happening. If anything, the crazy part of it, the psychic split of it, occurs in that clash with the internalized worldview. The phenomena itself is affirming on its own. We don't need external validation for that. We know that it happened. We know it's real. This is not, whether or not we're alone in the universe is not a question for people who have had these encounters. It's not a question. We know the answer to that. The problem, the brain ache of it, is that the reality of that runs smack headlong into this inner boundary of our worldview that says this is not possible. And getting the psyche to get comfortable releasing the death grip on that boundary is very difficult to do. It's a process. It takes time, and it's not something that happens immediately, because to try to break from it immediately, as ends up happening in these experiences, can create injury. That's the painful part of it, so.
Thank you for those clarifications. I think it's really important that, John did not use hypnosis as much as, people think that he did, but also, there are passages in abduction where, he would say, I would try to lead a witness. I would try to say, oh, did it happen like this? And they would say, no, it didn't happen that way. It happened this way. So the idea that he was just, feeding hypnotized people these narratives to get them to say what he wanted them to say. I think most people who read him seriously know that wasn't the case, but those accusations still,
Right.
float around in the discourse.
Right.
But this most recent point that you made is a really good kind of stepping off point for the next my next point or my next question. John's work was really influential to me when I first started getting into the phenomenon, reading about the UAP mystery. Abduction was one of the first books that I read, and I'm looking back at it. At the time, I really wasn't in a place to process it in a meaningful way, because it was so different from the worldview that I was raised in, my understanding of what the universe is and how it works. And then, even in his opening chapter, he's just talking about the nature of the phenomenon of the alien abduction phenomenon. And the first time that I was reading it, I was interested, but I didn't have a way to process it fully. Like, there were just parts of it, like, as language that you've used, it was kind of breaking my brain a little bit.
Yeah.
But there's a quote from the text. I've come back to this book many times since then. I use it quite often because I think that he was onto something really meaningful. And I do think that he was, to an extent, employing phenomenology in this text. He was looking at what appeared, and he wasn't passing judgment and saying, oh, this appeared to you, or you're reporting that this appeared in your consciousness, but this is too far from what we understand reality to be, so this must not be correct. So this is just a quote from Abduction that I think really, sums up his approach throughout the book. So he says, for a clinician like myself, trained in the Western tradition, the investigation of abduction cases presents special challenges, since much of the information that is obtained does not fit within accepted notions of reality. The temptation is to accept some experiences, especially those that appear to make some sort of sense within our space-time paradigm, and reject others as too far out there, too far from what we know as possible from a physical standpoint. I suspect such discriminations are neither wise nor useful. For the whole phenomenon is so bizarre from a Western ontological standpoint that to credit some experiences because they appear at least superficially familiar to us, and to reject others on the grounds of their strangeness seems quite illogical. My criteria for including or crediting an observation by an abductee is simply whether what has been reported was felt to be real by the experiencer and was communicated sincerely and authentically to me. So what I think is so important about this quote, and when he's, I mean, this quote is him laying out his method for us. You know, he is not, you know, listening to this testimony and then saying, I'm going to put, you know, I'm going to accept certain things that are going to make sense within some type of worldview that I understand, whether that's a purely scientific worldview, you know, physicalist worldview, or whether that's, you know, some type of ontological third space or something like that. You know, he's not saying I'm just going to take that specific group of experiences and put that over here because we can possibly make sense of it and just ignore everything that we can't. He really looked at, you know, the people that he deemed credible using these methods that you talked about. He really took everything they had to say, everything that appeared to their consciousness that they experienced, no matter how far from the current consensus reality it took him. Or it took us, you know, the readers too. Because that's why I think to an extent, you know, his work has been so influential and so profound, because he really looked at everything that appeared. He didn't discriminate and say, this thing is too far out there. That doesn't fit with my scientific understandings, or that doesn't fit with other understandings about, you know, psychic phenomena or something like that. This is everything that's appearing. This is what they're reporting. And if it's communicated sincerely and authentically, it was felt to be real by them, then I'm going to include it in my exploration of the phenomenon. And that really is a phenomenological approach. And I really think that that's what helped him. I know that this is a puzzling, you know, this is a mystery. Nobody has it figured out 100%. But I think that he got closer, at least when exploring the abduction phenomenon, than, you know, in my view, basically anyone else, because he took this phenomenological approach where he looked at everything. I don't know. Do you have any reflections on that?
Yeah, I have a few thoughts there. One, that the process that you're describing, you know, in terms of him, you know, kind of settling into an openness about the high strangeness, you know, so the full phenomenology of these encounters, or at least of what experiencers were describing, that was a process. He didn't walk into his introduction to this, you know, to this phenomenon and to experiencers expecting to find some alternative new reality, you know, presented to him. He expected, by his own admission, to find psychopathology, right? And he was surprised as he started interviewing experiencers that what we were describing was actually not presenting as psychopathology at all. And I think it's worth mentioning here, it's worth pausing to take a moment to understand better who John was before he became involved in this phenomenon. So he had, I believe at that point, easily 40 years of clinical psychiatric experience, right? And that wherein it was his role in supervising a staff of individuals at the Cambridge Department of Psychiatry at Cambridge Hospital, by the way, a department that he opened up, right, with other colleagues at the time. It wasn't in existence before they came in. As far as Cambridge, Massachusetts knew, they didn't have any people like that, right? You know, with severe mental health issues that needed that kind of service. So early on in his clinical career, he was already having to advocate on behalf of a vulnerable population that really needed assistance in relationship to the local, or how do you say it, the community leadership that insisted there was no need for this department of psychiatry. Obviously, they ultimately prevailed, and for decades, you know, he did his clinical work there, and it was his job to understand all manner of psychopathology, to be able to identify it. So whether it was, you know, psychosis or paranoia or depression or, you know, things related to suicide, whether it was with adults or with kids, it was literally his job to do that. And he was very well known and respected for his level of expertise in it, his warmth and compassion, his ability to meet not only his colleagues, but, you know, his patients right where they were at. So we're not talking about some random individual who's coming in and making, you know, random new therapists fresh out of, you know, fresh out of their master's or their bachelor's, suddenly, you know, making these large pronouncements about the mental well-being or capacity of experiencers. This is somebody at the prime of his of his profession and expertise, making evaluations that any of his colleagues and peers would have considered appropriate to make. If anyone was going to make those kind of evaluations, then John was certainly, you know, understood to be the person who would be capable of that. So that's the reputation he entered into this phenomenon with. And the fact that he carried the same intellectual courage and openness, right, allowed his, as he would call it, German Jewish, you know, scientific materialist worldview to be confronted by this new data. That speaks to who he was as an intellect, as a being of consciousness who understood in the very critical moment that he needed to open up and expand to accommodate something exotic that otherwise would not have fit into his worldview. So he should get credit for that, not criticism for that. And when people criticize him for saying, well, I believed experiencers because they're, you know, speaking with the appropriate affect, you know, and emotion. If anyone would have had the professional credibility and clinical credibility to do that, it was certainly his to do. So I do also have a thought about where he landed on his phenomenology, meaning why he ended up, like, the safe place he ended up planting his flag in terms of its ontological status. But I don't know that you want to go there yet, so I'll pause. Take a breath.
Yeah, I think that'll fit in perhaps maybe a little better later on. Sure. But I think what you just said was absolutely correct. You know, John wasn't just a random person who got interested in this. In a lot of ways, everything he had been doing up to that, not just, you know, his work in psychiatry, but his work in, you know, his concern about, you know, nuclear war and things like that. All of this was kind of preparing him in a way for being able to work with abductees and experiencers. And he does mention, like, he reflects, I think, in the final chapter of Abduction, you know, he says this, you know, my interest in this abduction phenomenon has taken me so far from my previous worldview, you know, in ways that I never thought would have been the case when I started.
Right.
So I think it's worth emphasizing that he came at this with the view of a psychiatrist. And as you said, he admitted that he originally thought that he was going to, you know, discover some type of psychopathology. And I think it's admirable, and, you know, we should commend him that when he saw that this did not meet the criteria for psychopathology, he continued down the path where it actually did lead him, even though that meant challenging his fundamental assumptions about reality,
Precisely.
which can be very difficult to do.
Yep.
So Karin, I would like to give you an opportunity, if you'd like, to speak about your own experiences, because I want to dig in a little bit more later about applying phenomenology to, experience or testimony. And if you want to share a little bit of your own, experience, I think that could help, further that discussion along. But this is as much as you want to share.
Okay. Okay, I'll try to find the right amount. I think, I'm 30 years on into this, if I'm not including, events that, anomalous events that happened when I was a young kid. So between maybe 2.5, 3 years old and like 8 or 9 years old, there was a whole slew of anomalous events that, as while I was growing up and as a young adult, I just chalked up to some weird way that my brain was processing, again, anomalous encounters. So I didn't think much of them other than they just were in this box of weirdness inside of my, brain somewhere. And I just left them there. I didn't assume that I was ever going to have an answer to, to why they were strange and why they had happened. So that being said, as the encounters, the physical encounters began with me in my mid-20s. So I'm in my mid-50s now. So we're 30 years into it. So and that's not 30 years of encounters. The encounters themselves lasted, maybe over a 3 to 4 year period of time. And until they came to a conclusion right at the end, somewhere around the end of the 20th century. And I have not had any encounters of that nature since then, which is true for any of the abduction experiencers that I know that were having that particular kind of interaction back then. It seemed to, whatever that was about, and there were experiencers, abduction experiencers have lots of opinions about what that's about. I won't go into that right now. I think it's a distraction, but whatever that was about, it finished in that way at that time. Now, I think there are ongoing qualities of interactions that are happening for other people right now. I have my own sort of weird stuff that's going on that wasn't happening before I had these encounters. So that one could argue that there's still some level of interaction occurring now, but it's nothing that I would ever stand up and talk about in front of people. I don't think it adds value. I think it can be distracting. So they're experiences that I, keep as fundamentally private and personal for me. But if you're asking about what is it that prompted me to find my way to John ultimately, and what are the kind of events that led to me identifying as someone who had these encounters as an abduction experiencer, I can speak a little bit to that. I'll be brief. I've told the story enough times that it either, if I'm really in it, then it can be very emotionally distressing, or if I stay emotionally sort of on the other side of it, then it can feel just mechanical. So I'll do my best to be helpful here and just spit out some elements of it that I think are will help tell the picture. I had been having, there was a couple, when I was around 25, I'd gone through, again, normal kids, mainstream reality. My life was unfolding as I had expected it was going to. And that doesn't necessarily mean professionally, but just I was living a normal life. And I did not have any preceding mental health issues. I was not on any medication. I was not an abuser of alcohol. And didn't do drugs, any of that, just normal young 20s person. But for a period of time, over the course of a few weeks, I started getting this level of anxiety that I liken to, what an animal might feel as a storm's coming. There was just this unease in me that I couldn't identify, I couldn't pinpoint. There wasn't anything in my life visibly or objectively that should have suggested that was happening. but I just felt like something was up. And one night when I'd gone to bed regularly, as I would normally do with my partner, I was awakened in the middle of the night to find myself flying at a low altitude, just above the tree line, in a place that looked like upstate New York. And when I had actually was living in California at the time. And as I came to consciousness at this low altitude, in a moonlit night, I noticed what looked to me like an old wooden roller coaster in the distance. I thought it was a really strange thing to take notice of, but it was there. And I blacked out for a minute and then came to standing straight up just inside the tree line of a forest that had a circular, kind of semicircular shape to it. And as I looked around, the trees were pretty spacious with each other. I looked around and could see other human beings in various states of dress and undress around me. And in front of us, sort of in the clearing, there were a number of different smaller individuals walking with smaller individuals toward each of these human beings that were there. And I was at that moment just completely in a state of shock. I didn't think that I had any business being there. I didn't know what I was doing there. There was nothing about what was happening that made sense to me. And as I was taking notice of my periphery and what was happening with the other human beings there, I noticed the small-ish person, maybe around 5 foot tall, feminine kind of feel to her, walking towards me with a small child-looking individual. As she approached me, I had this really sort of traumatic experience that I'm embarrassed to even talk about now, because I was really, I don't know how to say it. I was frightened maybe by how she looked, because she looked kind of human, but she clearly wasn't human. We would now refer to her as a hybrid, right? So, and she was pushing towards me, this child, with this thought of, and my understanding at the time, that she was indicating that there was some kind of relationship there. And it didn't make sense to me. I didn't have any children. I wasn't an aunt. So I pushed back, and she said no, and she pushed again, and I really resisted it again. And as I looked down at the child, I could see that it wasn't human either. It looked very alien, and I was traumatized by that. It had a very a kind of unemotional affect. I think we might identify him as looking sort of neurodiverse, at this point. And I wasn't having it. And she tried one last time, and this thought just pushed into my head. I heard this word, yours, he's yours. And suddenly I understood that she was saying that it was my kids, and that there was some fundamental relationship there. And I blacked out after that. And I woke up again while we were walking towards what I looked like a very bright, shiny silver Airstream trailer. So that's what my brain said it was. But as we walked inside, there was nothing inside that looked like anything I had ever seen before. The environment was completely exotic and foreign. And then I blacked out, and a second later, I was sitting straight up in bed. Felt like I had been gone for a week. I was severely dehydrated. I went to the refrigerator, drank about a gallon of milk straight, went to the bathroom, found myself looking for marks on my body. All of this was behavior that was completely foreign to me. And like just completely distressing. The next day, my fiance, he would turn out to be my fiance, woke up. I told him about it. And just strangely, that very next night, we were watching a show, and then one of the only shows that was ever on at that time happened to come on the night after. And in the show, there was a scene that showed these hybrid-looking children, and they looked almost identical to what I had seen the night before, which completely freaked me out. I'm like, what the hell is this validation? What the hell is this? So I was really distressed by that. And then 5 years later, after that event, in John's office, there was a manuscript lying on a table in John's office, and I opened it to a section with some drawings, some illustrations on it, and in the illustration was the exact environment that I had seen where I was. So the person, but from the opposite direction, including the roller coaster. in the background. So there was this weird confirmation, corroboration, right? But what are we going to do about it? And if it had only been that experience, I would have let it go. I wouldn't have chased after, try to get any help with what I was dealing with. I'll give you one more narrative that kind of ties it all together. We moved shortly after from California to Florida. Shortly after I had that encounter, we moved to the 3rd floor of an apartment building. I wanted to be up off the ground, which was weird for me. I normally wouldn't have had that anxiety. And all of a sudden, all holy hell started breaking loose. There were various different kinds of encounters and interactions that were happening, sometimes a couple of times a week. That included all kinds of psi phenomena and out-of-body experiences with beings, involved, and other encounters that felt very physical and real, the way you and I understand reality. But it was still, nothing was completely and entirely convincing, and I was starting to kind of lose it. It's like, this is such a weird phenomenon, and it's happening in ways that it feels like my brain is not wired to understand. I need something definitive here. And it's sort of just this feeling or thought that I shouted out to the universe internally. And, I think it was either that night or the night after, I was awakened in the middle of the night by a tickle on the back of my head. Our bed was kitty corner to the wall, and you could fit 2 or 3 adults, behind it. And I thought I had just, pushed too far, up to the headboard, and I scooted down a little bit, started to go back to sleep. And then I get this tickle again, which is very clearly a bony kind of finger waking me up. My anxiety level went through the roof. We would, as normally, expect ourselves to go, what the F is that? Sit up and look around and, try to run away from it. And instead, immediately fell back asleep again. This is something that experiencers describe over and over again, this nonsensical blacking out at the very moment that we are in fight or flight mode. We don't have any control over it. The next thing I know, it felt like maybe just minutes later, I feel this step on the end of my bed when I was there sleeping with my partner, who was completely passed out. He would not be awakened at the time. We didn't have any animals in the house. Nobody lived in the house. Didn't have any animals at all. And so there should have been no reason for me to feel any kind of weight depressing down on the end of my bed. And yet there was. And then after I don't know, maybe a minute or so, it felt like it was really just waiting to see if I was going to wake up. There was another step at the end of my bed, just now on the left side of my body. And then very slowly, I felt this thing about 25 pounds in weight, step by step by step, depressing its weight into the duvet until it got up to about my chest area. And it finally paused. And it put one knee on my chest, and then another let its weight rest down beside me. I felt a depression with a hand on either side. So I could feel that it was very, very close to me. And by this point, I was hyperventilating, and I was embarrassed about that. I was worried about my morning breath. And thought, oh God, I'm getting ready to meet E.T. And I have the stinkiest breath. And I get this wave of a thought in my head, like, that's of no consequence. It didn't care about that. And then it gave me this thought of something akin to, I'm not, I mean you no harm. And as it did that, something about the way that it vibrated that thought, I immediately relaxed. I felt this wave of love pour through my body. And then I heard, good. And then now you can open your eyes. And then as I was finally able to open my eyes, and I guess I should have mentioned I was paralyzed, this feeling of not being able to move, which again, not the same thing as sleep paralysis. I cannot emphasize that enough. I have sleep paralysis sometimes. It's really distressing. It's a completely different phenomenon. It's not that. This is like sticking your finger into a light socket and having that electrical current run through your body, but having it doesn't hurt. So there's clearly some override is happening in the central nervous system that prevents movements, and it's one of the ways that they generate safety when they're getting close to us. So that being said, while I was paralyzed and this thing was moving, up my body, and finally got to the place of telling me, all right, I can open my eyes. As soon as I did, I'm looking at this thing that looks like, a giant bug. It was not at all what I expected. And in fact, I just immediately sort of blurted out, Jesus Christ, you look like a fucking bug. It was, and it had this, this pointy kind of ant-like looking face. It had a black, kind of almost dolphin-like looking skin. It had these black, liquid black wraparound eyes. It felt to me like a biomechanical being, what we would understand now is some biological form of AI. It had a very skinny neck that was segmented all the way around the way a flexible desk lamp might be. And then its arms were made out of the same material, like flexy looking. And then the legs, same thing with a little body like that. And while I was trying to absorb this thing that was about right in front of my face, it then did this download into my mind, that felt like it was going 1,000 miles a second. And right when I thought I couldn't tolerate any more of it, it stopped. And then he went the other direction and then did an upload of what was in my mind. I saw, my life experiences, kind of flashing before my eyes. And just as I thought I couldn't stand that anymore, it stopped. And then that part of the interaction came to an end. There's more, but I'll leave it at that. The bottom line was because all of that happened in waking state consciousness with this thing in my environment, in my bed, having a body weight that I could, physiologically interpret and understand, that it was 8 to 10 inches in front of my face when I was interacting with it with my eyes open. That was it for me. Like, I like, okay, whatever the hell this phenomenon is, whatever its full phenomenology is, I know that some aspect of it manifests in 3D reality as we understand it. And that wrapped it up for me. That's when I could finally, let the worldview, this internal clash I was having with my worldview that said this isn't possible. I had to let it go. I had to let it go because it was so just in my face, literally in my face, right? And it was after that I started trying to find, a facilitator to help me understand what was going on. So that's my story. That's at least part of it. It's a piece of it. I don't know what your question was other than telling the story. What am I saying?
Well, yeah, I asked you about your experiences because we'll use them as a springboard for further discussion. Okay. But thank you, first of all, for being willing to share that in this context. And there's so much about, both of those stories that challenges our understanding of reality, kind of the boundaries of the real and the unreal as we've, in modern Western democracies, how we understand what exists and what doesn't, and what can happen and what can't. So much of what you described violates those, boundaries that are very sacred to, the rationalist mind. Mm-hmm. And that makes it difficult. And that's part of the reason that experiencer narratives and experiencer testimony has had such a hard time being taken seriously, even in, the UAP, people who take UAP seriously and people who take UFOs seriously and want to look at the radars and want to look at the, the instruments and, the landing patterns and, and the physical evidence, and they're willing to go that far. But then when it comes to, experience or witness testimony about being introduced to your hybrid child or some type of physical being that manifested in your room and you could feel the physical weight of it on you, and then, it goes back to wherever it came from, that just, it's too much for some people. It challenges the boundaries of reality. It goes too far. Yep. Even people who take UAP and UAP studies seriously, like, this is too far out there. Yep. And, something that I'd like to discuss further is, so there's this camp in UAP studies, the nuts and bolts folks, the more scientifically minded, like, let's look at the things that are observable and repeatable. And if there is something there, it has to be something that we're going to explain within, the laws that Einstein, gave us, or the expansion of them since then. But it's going to make sense within our modern scientific worldview in a physical way. There's another camp that will look at these experiences, and they'll say, well, we believe that what they're describing, was real to them, was something that they experienced, but we don't think it took place in physical reality. We think maybe it took place in some type of third space, like an altered state of consciousness, maybe the imaginal realm. Sometimes they call it the daimonic realm. And they don't want to, and they're willing to deal with the abduction accounts kind of there in that space, but they don't want to deal with aspects of abduction accounts that are in the physical space. And so I think that drawing those kind of lines is really problematic. I think it's problematic because, these experiences, these accounts, first of all, they challenge those boundaries, but they seem to take place in both. There are aspects of these encounters that you're describing and that other experiencers have described to me and to others that clearly were physical or biological, kind of manifested in the material plane, in what we would call waking consciousness. And from a phenomenological standpoint, it was sensory perception. They were phenomenologically real objects that were in front of you. And then you also described, you were having some type of strange psychic phenomena. You were having out-of-body experiences. And a lot of experiencers do report that. And I've interviewed some experiencers who their experience started out of body, and it started kind of in a dream state, and they met beings. And then when they woke up from that dream state, those beings were standing there physically in their room. And at that point, they were wide awake. So it seems that these encounters, they can appear in multiple ways, and they do appear or kind of, present themselves to consciousness, sometimes in physical, biological ways, sometimes in, imaginal, kind of psychic, metaphysical, we might use that word, ways. And sometimes it's both. And sometimes it starts in one space and proceeds to another. And so trying to say, I'm going to draw a line and I'm either going to look at it through this lens, or I'm going to look at it through the third realm spiritual lens, doesn't seem to me to be a wise way of approaching the phenomenon. And it's also not what phenomenology calls for us to do. Phenomenology says, hey, if there are aspects of this that are starting in some type of imaginal space, but then they're progressing into the physical space, well, you have to stick to what appears. You have to describe what appears, and you have to, you have to make those distinctions. And if an experiencer is saying this happened to me in physical reality, then with the phenomenological method, you don't say, well, that's impossible. That couldn't have happened in physical reality. So we're just going to dismiss that. So I think a wise approach, or I think the most useful or fruitful approach, is one that's going to look at everything, all of the ways that this phenomenon can and does appear to consciousness. And then, when we do try to make some type of judgment about the ontological status, we're not drawing lines that, exclude things prematurely and say it couldn't possibly have been this because of these assumptions that we're bringing to the table.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on those issues?
Well, first of all, I really appreciate how you articulated that. I agree with every word that you said there. And I think it's really critical at this point in the cultural and academic dialogues that we slow down at this point, right? Because until we really come to terms with with the ways in which we are not being intellectually rigorous, right? In how we're trying to make sense of this, we are creating a liability, an obstacle for ourselves in trying to really figure out what is actually going on. So, I think the metadata research project that we're planning with Archives, Jeff Kripal's Archives of the Impossible, is meant to really help maybe quiet some of the noise that enters into the conversation, right? So part of why it's difficult to get past or include all of the weird phenomenology is because we have so many different interpretations of what this is, that does not necessarily allow for it to the phenomenon to manifest in normal waking state consciousness as we imagine it. Like you say, there are plenty of examples of researchers and thinkers, academics, voting for this kind of third space daimonic realm, option, because it's most satisfying, or at least it's least, it creates sort of least liability. And it's, I think, in many ways, and by liability, I mean professional, reputational liability, but also it creates the least liability sort of psychologically. It still allows someone to mainly exist within the physicalist paradigm and venture outside of it in a way that says, well, sure, that, the consciousness piece is there, and I can imagine, what that might be like. And it allows this nebulousness and this unknowableness to sort of just persist in the discussion. When in reality, that if we can lift the data from these experiencer narratives, and we can just, again, sans any researcher interpretation, just what is the phenomenology? What do experiencers repeat over and over again? You mentioned a number of things right there. Sometimes it starts off in a dreamlike state and then ends up very physical. We wake up and these things are in our bedrooms. There are 3 of us standing around the edge of the bed, and we're like, holy shit, how did that happen? Or it starts out physical and then transitions into this, weird sort of out of body state. The kinds of things that are being communicated during those interactions, the presence of the whole hybrid piece of the narrative, and that's like sort of brain breaking to us, right? But how many times do human beings intervene on behalf of animals in our own world in exactly the same way? Animal husbandry is all about our intervention with animals to try to save species that are going extinct. I mean, I've got numerous articles about, rhinoceros and other species where humankind is taking active steps to preserve them or to create some new species out of it. Look at, pug-faced dogs compared to the wolf. That's human intervention. So we do these things, and it shouldn't be so strange to us that human beings are describing that there is some higher form of advanced intelligence that was, at least for a discrete period of time, interacting with us in similar ways. The problem is that it breaks our brain. That's where the worldview crash, the term ontological shock, that everybody's sort of talking about these days. That's where that comes in. It's we can't reconcile it. But I'd like to make a point here about, because I think John both beneficially and problematically contributed to this third realm, this daimonic realm, consignment. He co-signed onto that thinking, and he did so because he didn't know what else to do with it. And at the time, he was, talking to all of his colleagues that he respected, who might have any opinion or perspective that could be helpful and help, in helping him orient and ground into, well, what is this? Mainstream media wanted to, talk about the Harvard, psychiatrist who was, hanging out with aliens or endorsing aliens, the ET sort of thing. And that's what ultimately got him in hot water with Harvard University. But before that, in his interactions with Thomas Kuhn, for example, and I want to read this, when John was still trying to figure out what is the ontology here, in what reality is this happening, there are a number of quotes of John in interviews talking about Thomas Kuhn's impact on him. And I'll read one here. He says, I knew Thomas Kuhn as a child because our parents were friends. I used to go there every Christmas for eggnog and liver pate. When I started doing this work, I went to see him, and he was interested. he cautioned me in various ways. He advised me to just collect data, to try to suspend judgment, which is great. Both of those good. It's good advice. And to look out for the traps of language, like real, unreal, exist, doesn't exist, happened, didn't happen, intrapsychic, outside. He advised me to just to record what people were feeling and saying. And that's what I've tried to do. The other thing he said was, don't worry about science, because in this culture, science has become a new kind of theology. What you're really interested in, he said, is trying to learn something and gain knowledge, whether it'll satisfy science or not. Science prefers to study primarily within the purely material world, but don't worry about that. I'll pause it there for now. So there's some major implications out of that. John took that football, that ideology from that advice from Kuhn's, and he ran with it, right? And he did so beneficially. He allowed a conversation to emerge that gave us some means of talking about this phenomenon without totally dismissing it. But at the same time, in doing that, unintentionally, he dismisses the part of the phenomenon that does actually manifest in reality in the way that we're talking about it. And so some 30 years into it, we still have not come to terms, again, back to witness credibility. We're either believing people or we're not around this. We're either suffering from psychopathology or we're not. And if we're not suffering from psychopathology and we are credible witnesses, then we need to take down the data and consider all of it, even the parts of it that are wildly confrontational to our belief structures. And in doing so, what I think can happen is not something terrible, but what emerges is a much clearer understanding, a much higher res image of how the universe actually operates. So the thing that we call psi phenomena is actually natural phenomena, right? The ability to move between a very physical part of reality to a less physical sort of fabric of reality. That if we really understood how the universe worked, then that's not weird. It's just what's possible when a species or an intelligence has advanced enough, right? And I think that's where we're trying to get to now, is really grokking what the phenomenology is telling us about the universe in which we live.
This is really interesting, and it's reminding me of a quote or just a passage. There was a book that Whitley Strieber wrote with Jeff Kripal. They wrote it together. It's called The Supernatural. But Whitley, in one of his chapters, he's saying that, or he argues that he thinks that this is a purely natural phenomenon, meaning that, what the intelligence or the NHIs are doing is not violating the laws of physics. They just have a much deeper understanding of physics and how to do things like move from, an out of body experience into, being physically present in the room. He argues that this essentially is just how the universe works. It is essentially going to be all natural laws.
Yep.
There's nothing necessarily supernatural in the traditional sense going on, but just it's that which goes beyond. That which is natural, but goes beyond science as we currently understand it. But a deeper understanding of how the universe actually works will reveal how they're able to do these things.
Agreed. I totally agree with that. 100%. Yep.
Awesome. No, this is Karin, this has been really great. We're approaching about an hour and a half now, but if I think we've covered some really important ground here today, and I think that this is really, really first of all, I think it's all very important. I think it's also, your way of approaching this is so powerful because, first of all, you are an experiencer yourself, and, you can speak very coherently about everything that happened to you. It's not like, you're a paradigm example of someone who was just an ordinary person who had an extraordinary experience. And but you're also able to really see the bigger picture and the importance of what's going on for our understanding of reality itself. And how getting experience or testimony out there and getting witness testimony about the things that people have experienced can, and hopefully will at some point, kind of fundamentally shift some of these deeply held assumptions that we have about reality. So I just want to thank you for sharing your story, for being courageous enough. First of all, it takes courage to speak about these kind of things publicly. I don't think that I acknowledge enough to you or other experiencers, that it really, it takes courage to go out there and say, hey, this happened to me and it was real. So I want to thank you for that. But I also just want to thank you for everything that you're contributing to this conversation and to John's legacy, and where Jemmy is hopefully going to be headed in the next few years. I'm excited about the metadata project. I'm excited about all of the projects at Jemmy, and yeah, I just want to really thank you for the excellent work that you're doing.
Thank you very much. I receive that with an open, warm heart, and I feel the same about you. I think you're a valuable asset, very valuable asset to the experiencer community and to humankind's exploration of the phenomenon in general. It's really important that we have researchers, investigators, inquiring minds, academics like yourself who are willing to leave all of the data on the table, not take off some of it that's not convenient, right? But leave it all there. And then together over the course of time, as we begin to understand more and more about it, then, begin to form, a narrative about what it actually is. I think if there are two things I would want to leave with today, one is that humankind will be well served in suspending belief and disbelief, right? And we're really good at suspending belief, but we're not so good at suspending disbelief while we're going through this process. We don't have to claim, and we shouldn't claim, that we know everything about what this phenomenon is. It's simply untrue. We just know that it is, that it's emergent, that it is teaching us something, and that it makes sense. That the only way to really responsibly handle it is to receive what it's sharing and then be open to learning about what it is, and that's going to take time. So we can't rush that process. So that's thing one, remaining open and doing so from a grounded but intellectually curious way that will serve us in every way that we can imagine. That's thing one. Thing two, for what it's worth, as someone who has had these experiences, but who was also just Jill Q public before that, I'm deeply empathetic with the challenge that the normal person, member of the public would, mainstream public would have listening to these encounters and trying to make peace with them, because it is so brain breaking, because it is so confrontational, because nobody wants to be duped, because we don't have a worldview, construct for this yet. There are so many reasons for someone from the public to just think, I don't know, and so I think it's important that people in the mainstream, again, myself included, understand that there's this fundamental empathy with the impossibleness of this and the discomfort that it causes, and that it's okay to feel that way. That's a normal part of the process, and we shouldn't let that initial, whoa, this can't be possible, stop us from moving forward to try to understand what it actually is. It's like the resistance is a part of opening and softening, our worldview aperture, so that we can absorb more information. So that's it. Empathy on all sides. It's a challenge, and it's also really exciting. The proverb, may you live in exciting times, and boy do we. Who knew?
Um, Thank you for that. And I actually, I'm a really good example of exactly what you're talking about, because the first few times that I mean, honestly, like I said, the first time that I read John's book, I was just like, I don't know, this is too out there for me. Like, I'm interested in UFOs, but this is a little too much. And as I came to terms with the reality of it, because I read his book and I started reading other books, and then I started reading his books again. And as I gradually had to accept it, there were times that it was greatly uncomfortable, even for me, who is not an experiencer. I have not had any encounters, but accepting the reality of these accounts was difficult. I will completely affirm, what you said that way, and completely affirm to anyone who, has difficulty accepting this the first time that they hear about these kind of accounts.
It's reasonable.
It's very reasonable.
Right. It's just that it needs to not, prevent us from again moving forward and exploring and trying to understand what it is. Because just because the resistance is there doesn't mean that the encounters didn't happen. They did happen. And in some ways they're ongoing, and in some ways even more so now because of how many UAP are being spotted in the sky and tracked, in various different, forms of radar. So the phenomenon has not disappeared. And we're learning more and more through the process of disclosure that, lo and behold, that there may be, black ops parts of the government or intelligence community that actually know more about this than what we imagined. Who knows what we'll see? But, over the course of time, this genie out of the bottle, I think, is not going to be ever put back in the bottle. It's just going to get bigger and bigger until we're living in a universe of a new genie, whatever that looks like. Weird metaphor to end with, but nonetheless.
No, I think you're completely correct. And I'll also affirm the second thing that you said. It's exciting and it's fun. Once you can get past that, it's overused, but that ontological shock that you will go through once you take these encounters seriously, once you move past that, it's exciting stuff and it's exciting times. And, I couldn't be happier that I am taking it seriously. And I do, I do believe experiencers, and I just very excited to see where we go from here. Like, exciting times.
Agreed. Fantastic.
All right.
Thank you for giving us the time. I really appreciate the conversation, Kim.
And I appreciate you coming on so much.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.